What do you do when the most powerful military on Earth spends 13 nights telling you exactly where the next blow is going to fall, and you still don't move? That's the question at the center of this story. The answer arrived this week, and it did not arrive quietly. Before we go further, because this is the kind of story that shapes what you pay at the pump next month, not just what shows up on a map thousands of miles away. Subscribe if you want to follow this war as it happens, not weeks after everyone else has caught up. Some islands are guarded by walls, some by soldiers lined along the shore. Kharg Island was never guarded by either. For decades, its real protection was the simple fact that striking it directly was considered too costly for anyone to seriously try. That protection just ran out. Kharg sits in the northern Persian Gulf, roughly 25 miles off Iran's southwestern coast. It isn't a fortress. At its core, it's a loading station, deep-water jetties, and pipelines built to pump crude into the hulls of some of the largest tankers on the planet. Here's the number that explains why this stretch of coastline matters more than almost anywhere else in this war. Roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports pass through Kharg before reaching a single buyer anywhere on Earth. 9 out of every 10 barrels Iran sells abroad move through this one point first. Nearly Iran's entire financial lifeline, the money keeping the state running, the military supplied, the currency from collapsing under sanctions, funnels through pipelines sitting on one strip of sand and coral, with no backup site anywhere close to matching what Kharg processes in a week. Smaller terminals exist at Bandar Imam Khomeini on the mainland, on Lavon Island, on Siri Island, but none of them, even combined, can replace what Kharg does alone. That's why, for years, American planners treated a direct strike on Kharg as a line nobody wanted to cross, not because it was hard to hit. Precision weapons can reach almost anything, but because of what happens afterward. You don't just dent a budget for a season, you reshape what a country can sell, to whom and at what price, for years. And that damage doesn't stay contained inside one ledger. It spills into global oil markets, and global oil markets touch everyone at a gas pump anywhere in the world. For months, even as strikes hit military depots, radar sites, missile stockpiles, and drone positions across Iran, Kharg's oil infrastructure stayed untouched. When American aircraft did strike the island back in spring, targeting stayed narrow on purpose. Storage tied to naval mines, sites connected to missile systems threatening the Strait of Hormuz. The export terminal itself was left standing. That wasn't an accident, that was policy. Now let's talk about the 13 nights before that policy broke, because what sets this moment apart isn't only what finally happened. It's everything said publicly beforehand, and what Iran's leadership chose to do about it. Through the early summer, tension along the Strait of Hormuz kept climbing. Iran had agreed on paper to stop threatening commercial shipping there. Traffic resumed, then attacks on tankers started again, and a fragile calm collapsed within a week. The American president stood at a NATO summit and declared the ceasefire finished. Strikes resumed, and this time the warnings carried a name that hadn't been spoken so directly before: Kharg Island. Night after night, through public statements and military signaling, Washington made its intentions unmistakable. Go after the energy base, hit the infrastructure, funding the war. Each warning gave Tehran another chance to disperse assets before something that looked less like a bluff with every passing night. For 13 straight nights, Iran did not move a thing. Sit with that, because it explains almost everything that follows. When a government is warned about a specific named target more than a dozen times and still doesn't relocate what's inside it, only 2 explanations hold up. The first, Iran's leadership genuinely believed the warnings were theater. Pressure built to extract concessions at a table, not an actual plan waiting to launch. Governments bluff constantly, and after enough rounds without follow-through, it's tempting to assume the next round plays out the same way. The second is far more unsettling. Maybe Iran's leadership believed the warnings completely and still decided that moving the asset created a worse danger than absorbing the hit, that there was nowhere safer to send infrastructure like this, or that any visible attempt to disperse it would signal weakness at the exact moment weakness invites more pressure. Maybe the real calculation wasn't whether the strike was coming, but which version of the damage was survivable. A country that stays still after 13 direct warnings isn't a country that misunderstood the threat. It's a country that ran the numbers somewhere we'll never see, and concluded its options were narrower than anyone outside realized. And then, last night, the warning stopped and the strike landed. If you're feeling the weight of that, good. What happens next decides whether this becomes the moment that ends the war, or the moment that makes it far more dangerous for everyone tied to it, including people who've never once thought about a small island in the Persian Gulf. Let's talk about exactly what was hit, because the precision matters for understanding what recovery looks like. This wasn't a strike on residential areas or general shipping lanes. It hit the operational heart of the place, the loading and pumping systems on Kharg's primary export terminal, the machinery that moves crude from underground pipelines into waiting tankers. Now, that distinction changes everything. Damage to military hardware can often be patched through ordinary logistics. Damage to specialized export infrastructure is different entirely. It demands precision engineering and components originally built and certified by companies now legally forbidden from supplying Iran with anything at all. Iran has weathered infrastructure damage before, building real domestic engineering capacity after earlier conflicts cut it off from Western parts. That self-sufficiency is genuine, but there's a real gap between keeping aging equipment running through careful maintenance and rebuilding infrastructure that's just been deliberately targeted by weapons designed for exactly that purpose. The repair timeline isn't measured in days, and it isn't realistically measured in weeks. It depends on whether Iran can source what it needs through partners willing to move sensitive components through supply chains already strained by this war. Here's a principle worth holding on to, because it reaches far beyond one island. You can destroy in 30 minutes something that took 30 years to design and calibrate. You cannot rebuild that capacity in 30 months if the certified parts stay sanctioned, and the engineers who understand the system best are legally barred from going near it. That asymmetry, destruction moving faster than reconstruction ever can, is the real story underneath the smoke over the Gulf right now. Why did Washington pick this target now? For most of this war, American strategy stayed inside a consistent boundary. Hit the Revolutionary Guard, missile depots, radar sites, drone positions, but stay away from infrastructure with direct consequences for global commodity markets. That boundary no longer holds. This isn't a tactical decision about one target on one night. It's a threshold decision, signaling a fundamental shift in what costs are now considered acceptable. Every government watching, whether or not they have troops near the Gulf, is recalculating what that shift means. Gulf monarchies watching their own energy infrastructure, Beijing leaning on discounted Iranian crude, Moscow with its own workarounds for sanctioned oil. That's not a regional signal, that's a global one. Iran's oil revenue throughout this war has never moved through open channels. It flows through intermediaries, sold at steep discounts, routed to stay invisible to Western financial monitoring. But even under those constrained conditions, Kharg was still moving oil every day, not at pre-sanctions volumes or prices, but enough to keep the government's operating budget from collapsing and to help fund the military campaigns, proxy networks, and weapons programs that have defined this war. The harder question is what fraction of Iran's current operating revenue was flowing through this terminal at the exact moment of the strike. And even analysts with the best satellite imagery and financial tracking are genuinely unsure. What isn't uncertain is who's watching closest. China, Iran's steadiest customer for discounted crude, is reportedly tracking Kharg's status this week, and India's refineries, which have kept quiet purchase arrangements running, are working through the same calculations behind closed doors. The oil itself hasn't vanished from the ground. What's damaged is the mechanism for getting it out onto a tanker and into the global market. And that uncertainty is exactly what commodity markets fear most, because it can't be hedged with confidence. You can plan around a known shortage. It's far harder to plan around one with no confirmed end date. Repairing this kind of damage is genuinely hard. Kharg's infrastructure was built using foreign specifications and equipment developed over decades before sanctions cut Iran off from that access, and the companies that built it are now legally barred from supplying replacement parts. Iran's domestic engineering base has grown, but there's a measurable gap between keeping old equipment limping along and rebuilding what's just been deliberately, precisely targeted. That gap is measured in months at minimum. Here's where this story stops living only in the Persian Gulf. When a terminal responsible for a meaningful share of global oil supply takes damage with no confirmed repair timeline, markets don't wait for an official assessment. They price in the uncertainty almost immediately, the way they have during earlier strikes on regional oil infrastructure. Kharg is structurally different from a shipping lane a tanker can route around. There's no backup facility sitting idle, ready to absorb the load. That chain reaches further than most people realize. Gasoline prices connect to it. Heating bills connect to it. Shipping costs, import prices, the tags on ordinary goods on shelves thousands of miles from this war, all of it traces back through a long, mostly invisible pricing chain to this narrow stretch of water. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, this isn't a distant headline. It's next week's number at the pump. It's October's heating bill, a quiet cost nobody in government will ever stand up and take responsibility for, even though it traces directly back to decisions made nowhere near a gas station. Now let's turn to what determines where everything goes from here. Kharg being struck doesn't end this war. It forces Iran into a decision that will shape the next chapter more than almost anything that's happened so far. Iran has 4 realistic paths available. The first is the option Iran has threatened publicly for months: a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, Not harassment of individual vessels, but a complete shutdown of the single most important energy choke point on the planet. It's also the hardest for Iran to follow through on, because closing Hormuz destroys Iran's own remaining export. Routes too, and turns every Gulf government, including ones quietly sympathetic to Iran, into direct victims of Tehran's decision. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves through that strait daily. Closing it would flip Iran's global image overnight, from a country under attack to a country causing a worldwide economic crisis. The second is a smaller, targeted response, striking something of comparable economic weight without triggering the full catastrophe a Hormuz closure would guarantee. A move against Saudi or Emirati infrastructure or a specific shipping target would keep the conflict escalating on Iran's own timeline rather than purely reacting to Washington's. The third is what some analysts call the shift and sustain strategy. Iran redirects remaining export capacity towards secondary terminals. Bandar Imam Khomeini on the mainland, the smaller points at Lavan and Syria. None of them, even combined, can fully replace Kharg, but together they're enough to keep some revenue flowing while repair proceeds, with Russia's own parallel sanctioned oil logistics becoming an even more direct partner. The oil keeps moving, at lower volume and price through longer, costlier routes, but it moves, and the government preserves the image of having absorbed a serious blow and kept functioning. The fourth generates the least immediate noise and may carry the most significant long-term consequences. Iran deepens its role as a supplier of weapons and support to its regional proxy network, sustained by supply chains that remain at least partially functional even after a strike of this scale. Under this model, Iran converts an oil revenue problem into a leverage problem. The message becomes simple. You cannot fully shut down what I'm capable of doing without confronting every network I currently supply, and that costs more than whatever you gained by striking one island. This isn't new for Iran. It's a strategy it has leaned on for decades, and a strike that removes a large share of its cash income can make this approach more attractive, not less, shifting its leverage away from economic assets it no longer fully controls, and toward military coercion it still controls completely. Weakening a government economically doesn't automatically reduce its willingness to use force elsewhere. Sometimes it does the opposite. Let's zoom out, because looking at this strike in isolation risks making it seem more conclusive than it is. This is, without question, the most economically significant single military action this war has produced. But it isn't, by itself, a knockout blow that strips Iran of its ability to act or sustain the networks it has spent 4 decades building. Iran's government survived sanctions that cut it off from the global banking system, and years of sustained military pressure. The strike adds a new category of economic consequence to that ledger. It doesn't close it. The real question is whether this blow pushes Iran's leadership toward a negotiating position it had previously refused to consider, or strips away enough of what it had left to lose that it now calculates there's less reason to hold anything back. Those two outcomes look nearly identical for the first several days, but tend to look very different 6 weeks later, once the shock wears off and the real decisions start showing up in how each side behaves. History doesn't offer clean answers about which kind of pressure produces which outcome. A few things are worth watching closely. Whether Iran visibly ramps up activity at its secondary terminals on commercial satellite monitoring, whether China says anything official about disruption to its Iranian oil arrangements, Beijing's silence will say more than any formal statement, and the actual ship movement data through the Strait of Hormuz, which can reveal quiet Iranian pressure on shipping before any official response is announced. Every one of those threads connects back to the same question at the heart of this story. For 13 straight nights, Washington told Tehran exactly what was coming, and Iran's leadership weighed whether the warning was a bluff, whether moving assets was more dangerous than staying put, or whether diplomacy might still produce a solution first. Iran was wrong about at least one part of that calculation. But what this strike proves isn't that Iran has been defeated or that this war is close to over. It proves that a threshold has been crossed, the one that used to protect civilian-adjacent economic infrastructure with direct global commodity consequences. That restraint existed because crossing it meant accepting fallout that's hard to contain once it spreads. It no longer holds the way it once did. Every government in the region is now quietly recalculating what the United States is prepared to target once the cost of holding back outweighs the cost of acting. And so is every government watching from outside, with no direct stake in this war, but plenty of stake in global energy prices. An island doesn't need an army to defend it. It needs distance, and enough perceived consequence attached to closing that distance that nobody's willing to try. Kharg Island lost that distance after 13 nights of warnings that almost nobody outside a small circle was paying attention to. What Iran does next determines the true scale of what was lost. something recoverable, patched together while the war grinds on, or something that permanently changes the cost calculation of this war for everyone connected to it. Those two futures start out looking almost identical. They rarely stay that way for long. Somewhere tonight, in a household far from any headline about this island, someone is quietly checking an oil price dashboard, trying to figure out what those numbers mean for decisions they need to make before the week is out. And somewhere tonight, a crew aboard a tanker in the Persian Gulf is watching the water, working out what the next few days look like for the route they're sailing. Neither of them chose this war. They're simply managing the consequences of choices made in capitals far from where they're standing, the way ordinary people connected to this conflict have been doing for months, mostly without recognition, the part of this story that rarely gets told with the weight it deserves. This story is far from finished. The real answer won't come from a press release or a political statement. It will come from what Iran's commanders actually choose to execute, on the ground and on the water, in the days ahead, not the rhetoric surrounding it. That's the moment worth watching for, and when it comes, we'll be right here to break it down clearly, the same way we always have. If this helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter of this story is likely already forming somewhere off that same coastline right now, and you won't want to find out about it secondhand. I'll see you in the next one.